5:33.
Sounds good. Sarah, have we let people in?
I just admitted everyone.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to give folks a few more minutes, one more minute, to sit down in their seats and join this discussion. So please be patient and wait just one more minute while others are joining. And thanks again for joining us tonight. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's presentation hosted by the City and County of Denver. My name is Vanita Curry, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight as we talk about the Kearney Krameria corridor. Let me tell you a bit about how to provide feedback during our time together on this next slide. Your mic will be muted during the presentation, but we will stop to welcome your questions during our Q&A breaks. If you would like to ask a question, just type it into the chat box. You see the little icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll be using the chat box to forward your questions to the project team. On this next slide, I'd like to introduce several of our panelists and speakers tonight. I'm joined by experts from the City and County of Denver, including Ryla Lamy, Ellen Forhofer, and Dana Hoffman. They are all from the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. We also have a team of consultants, including Taylor Phillips and Charles Alexander, who will lead part of our discussion tonight and help us answer your questions during our Q&A breaks. I'd like to welcome all of our team. On this next slide, let's talk about the topics for today. We will give you an overview of the project and take a look at the project schedule. We'll play a new video for you that shows what a neighborhood bikeway looks like in Denver. We'll pause to take your questions before highlighting survey results for East Colfax and other locations throughout the Kearney Krameria corridor. We'll take more of your questions before ending the evening with ways for you to stay engaged. Riley will lead us and get us started with an overview.
Great, thanks so much, Vanita. And thanks everyone again for joining us tonight and taking the time out of your busy evening to be able to join us as we talk more about this project. I just want to remind everyone of where we're currently at in the process. So we had a meeting to introduce the project back in a few months ago in March, and March 17th to be exact, where we introduced the project and alerted you how you could provide your feedback. And at that point in the process, we were currently taking your feedback about where there are concerns and both with traffic or with safety, and how we can improve safety and reduce traffic on Kearney and Krameria Street. Based on that feedback, we have done some additional research and had discussions with a lot of you. And based on that feedback are now to the point where we have some concepts or some designs that are being recommended. And that's what we're here to share with you tonight. I do want to emphasize that we're still very early in the process. And so we are trying to get your feedback while also being flexible. It's important for us to hear from you and hear your feedback, and we also value your input. And we oftentimes in projects like this change our design or make tweaks to the design based on the input that we hear from you. And so it is incredibly important that we get your feedback, and we thank you again for all of those that have provided their feedback so far. And the next phase of the project will be getting into kind of we'll be taking what we hear from you tonight and then be providing an additional update either later in the summer or in the early fall. So that's just kind of the timeline for the project that we're on now. And so just wanted to remind everyone of where we're at currently in the process. So then on the next slide, as I mentioned before, we have heard from a lot of you. And so I do want to thank everyone who has engaged with us so far on the project and provided both their thoughts, their concerns, and ideas. Again, we've heard from a lot of different, from people all across the corridor on Kearney and Krameria Streets. So we really do thank you for all of the feedback that you have provided. Just a reminder of the project. So this is currently looking at Kearney and Krameria Street from East Smith Road down to East Virginia Avenue. This was a project that was identified for funding from the Elevate Denver Bond Program that was passed by voters in 2017, which is part of a larger package of improvements all across the city to improve safety and our transportation system for Denver, both now and in the future. This project was also identified from the Denver Moves Bicycles Plan, and which was developed through community input and updated both or several times. One of the things I also wanted to mention is one of the reasons why this street was identified in that plan is because it's one of the few streets that connects north-south as a local street that can provide a kind of a direct connection for people walking and riding bikes on a street that is low volume and not as busy as some of the other streets that go north and south, like you see on the map, such as Monaco Street. Next slide, please. So again, just wanted to emphasize, you'll notice that there on the map that there are a lot of different colors highlighted. This just shows you the overall bicycle network that was identified from the Denver Moves Bicycles Plan. There's different colors because those mean different things. So there's been a question that has continued to come up, which is this going to be a painted bike lane? And the answer to that question is for the most part, no. A neighborhood bikeway, which is what this is identified as, is a shared street where we primarily focus improvements on the intersections to help both bikes and pedestrians safely get across those busier streets. One of the other reasons for the particular routing that was chosen from the Denver Moves plan was also to connect into the Cherry Creek Trail. There is a spur that's south of Virginia Street that would connect people riding bikes and pedestrians to get to the Cherry Creek Trail. And that, again, that's one of the reasons for this particular alignment. We have continued to get quite a few questions, and I understand that there's some confusion about what a neighborhood bikeway is. And so I'm just going to talk through a little bit about what that is before we show a video that will kind of help provide some additional explanation. As I mentioned before, a neighborhood bikeway is not a painted bike lane. It's a shared street, just like what it is today. So where bikes and cars share the roadway, but really we focus improvements at the intersections that are designed to make it safer for people walking, biking, and driving, and help be able to get across the street more safely. The majority of the improvements that are recommended from a neighborhood bikeway are signage and pavement markings, just like what you see on the screen. And then at select locations where we hear from the community that there is a challenge with speeding, or where we hear from the community that there are challenges getting across the street, we may recommend some improvements such as curb extensions, which is what you see on the screen, or a traffic circle, or things that are designed to slow down vehicles and slow down speeding traffic. The other thing that neighborhood bikeways are intended to do is to prioritize local traffic instead of cut through traffic. So when I say that, what I mean is we understand that a lot of streets are busier than they used to be because Denver as a city has grown. Neighborhood bikeways are designed to encourage only local traffic as well as bicycle traffic, and keep the street as a local, low volume street as the city continues to grow. So once again, just to highlight a neighborhood bikeway is really to the purpose of them are design treatments that prioritize safety. They are also meant to increase the visibility of everyone that's using the street today, and are designed to slow down speeds and then restrict traffic volumes. There's also been a question that we oftentimes get, which is parking eliminated throughout the corridor? And the answer to that is no. We really, based on it being a shared condition, parking remains intact throughout. we're going to show you a quick video just so that we can show you what a neighborhood bikeway looks like on a Denver example, which is on East 35th Street, or sorry, West 35th in the Highland neighborhood. So we'll give you just a 20-second video that I'll kind of walk you through. So this is an example of a traffic circle that you can see. Again, this is on East 35th. There's only about 2 or 3 of these, I believe, proposed on Crimeria throughout the entire corridor. Other than that, you can see it's shared in addition. There is you also just notice that there was a bulb out or a curb extension. So that's really what a neighborhood bikeway is. It won't notice a whole lot in between the intersections, but again, just focusing on safety improvements that help people to more safely get across the street. And that's really what they're designed to do, or is the purpose of them. So on the next slide, we're going to pause there for questions before we get into the next part of the presentation, where we will discuss what is being recommended and how you can provide your input on that. So I'm going to turn it over to Nora, who's going to help facilitate us our question and answer session.
I'm so sorry. I was having trouble with my mute button.
No problem.
Thanks, Riley. Please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we're going to do our best to answer them. This is the first Q&A session that we have, and there will be another one after we've gone through more detail regarding the actual treatments. I think we're going to start with a very general question regarding neighborhood bikeways and whether they are intended to attract sort of additional traffic, and how that works in a neighborhood. And
sorry, I just realized I was on mute. So great question. So a neighborhood bikeway is actually intended to discourage traffic. So by these treatments. And so the purpose behind them is that it's improving safety for everybody, whether you drive, bike, or walk, but really trying to encourage only local traffic, not encourage additional traffic.
Thanks, Riley. Another question related to the nature of bikeways is, how do you decide where to put the treatments, and how do you decide which treatments to use?
Great question. A lot of times, and I will also let Charlie or Taylor elaborate on this, but basically there's 2 main ways. One of them is from what we hear from the community. So as we're trying to address safety improvements and improve the street for people driving, walking, and biking, one of the things that's most important is the input that we hear from the community. So a lot of the places that we hear at particular intersections where we've heard a lot of complaints or a lot of concerns, we'll look at how we can address those concerns or complaints. The second way that we recommend a treatment or a proposed improvement at a particular intersection is also based on our data that we look at. So we look at speeds, we look at where there's been previous crashes, and it's a combination of those 2 things that allows us to look at how to make improvements for the street.
And yeah, Riley, I can jump in there and answer a little bit more and elaborate. Specifically, we get a lot of questions about curb extensions versus traffic circles. And a lot of that is really to do with kind of the geometry of the intersection and how wide the streets are that are coming together. In a few of our designs, we actually also had some of those really long gutters that go all the way across the intersection, and we don't want cars to be dipping in and out and in and out to get around to traffic circles. So those kinds of intersections we'll recommend curb extensions instead.
Thank you. We do have a question about a particular treatment, traffic circles. Are they landscaped? Is there a way for them to not be an eyesore in the neighborhood?
So I can start with that question. We have put these in a couple different locations, and in the past, there's ways for a neighborhood, for example, to paint the inside of them or decorate the inside of them. So if they do look a little more aesthetically pleasing. In the near term, they are kind of built with lower cost materials. And one of the intentions that in the long term is that these can be upgraded and built with more costlier, more aesthetically pleasing materials. A lot of it is just based on the funding that we have available for us at the time.
I can jump in and add a bit to that, Riley. Thanks for that question. My name is Ellen Forthofer. I'm a planner with DOTI, the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And a lot of the reason, to Riley's point, that we're looking at all materials available to us is that these improvements have safety as the foundation. And by looking at all materials available to us to install them, we're often able to realize safety improvements at a faster timeline than we would be able to with larger civil projects. So as he mentioned, there are some opportunities to paint some murals, look at how they can really be made their own by the community. But for the most part, safety is at our foundation, and that is what we are considering as our top priority with any improvements within the right of way.
Thanks, Ellen. I am going to ask one more question that is generally related to bikeways, and then I'm going to pass it on to Ellen so that we can get to the more specifics of what's being considered for the corridor. There is a question related to who has the right-of-way in a bikeway, and how the people who use bikeways, how can we best educate them to understand sort of what the right-of-way interaction should be.
So I can take that question and then feel free to elaborate, Ellen. So depending on the type of bikeway, so when we say a neighborhood bikeway, because we're talking about streets that are shared between people riding bikes and cars, it's really similar to driving. Whoever gets to the stop sign first has the right of way, but both bicycles and vehicles have the right of way and are expected to share the road, which is largely what happens on a lot of the street today. If it's a dedicated bike lane like we have in some other areas of the city, then bikes have the right of way in the bike lane itself. But for a street like this where it's shared, it's both vehicles and bikes that have the right of way, except for obviously pedestrians when they're waiting to cross at the intersection.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Riley. Go ahead.
Sorry, I would just highlight that on all roads in Denver currently, bicycles are seen as vehicles. So there is already precedent across every road in Denver for that shared space. A neighborhood bikeway really formalizes what that sharing looks like, and also it includes multimodal improvements, particularly at intersections, to help increase visibility and safety for everyone using the road, whether you're walking, biking, or driving. But did just want to highlight specific to right-of-way on streets in Denver, that condition already exists where bikes and cars share right-of-way and obviously yield to people walking.
Thanks, both Riley and Ellen. We have lots and lots of questions in the chat that I'd like to reserve for the next Q&A because they're specific to treatments on the corridor. And I would like to pass it over to Ellen to share those, the specifics on the corridor. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Nora. And thank you all for your questions. Again, as Nora mentioned, please keep those coming. We will have additional opportunities tonight to answer more questions. So please continue to put those in the chat and we'll get to them as we can throughout the meeting. As Anita mentioned earlier, my name is Ellen Forthofer. I am an urban planner with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And I'll quickly walk through some of the survey results. We had a survey open earlier in the spring to help us gather community feedback as we developed initial concepts, which we'll share later tonight. And this survey, the responses really helped us form that initial concept. So we had over 260 responses, with 90% of respondents living in neighborhoods along this corridor. We heard loud and clear that there was a priority to make it safe and comfortable to ride a bicycle, as well as safe and comfortable to walk and roll on this corridor through reducing the speed of vehicles. And apologies, my dog is saying hi, he loves to do that. As well as focusing on making it safe and comfortable to cross at intersections throughout the Kearney Krameria corridor. As I mentioned, 90% of our respondents lived in the neighborhood, and we did ask people to indicate how they typically move through the corridor. People were open to selecting multiple modes, as if you're anything like me, really depends on the day and sometimes the weather what I do. But you can see here, we had 72% of people indicate that they will drive on the corridor from time to time. 53% of people indicating walking and rolling is something that they do on the corridor often, and 49% of people indicating that they bike. So just want to highlight that this is already a multimodal corridor, and this neighborhood bikeway is really looking at how we can formalize that and institute some multimodal improvements to continue to formalize that space. So on the next slide, I'll just speak really briefly to the bike planning process throughout all DOTI projects. So DOTI, again, is the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. And anytime that we look at a bikeway project, we begin with a network verification. So confirming that we're looking at the right facility types for the correct corridors based on existing conditions. We then develop options and a concept design before completing the design and moving towards construction. And just want to highlight that is a very high level view of the process. Interwoven throughout these steps are public involvement opportunities like tonight. And as Riley mentioned earlier, just want to highlight, we are in those earlier phases right now as we're just developing options and understanding what makes sense for this connection in the network inside of town. So with that, I wanted to highlight one of the major things that we heard in our initial concept survey was about Crimeria and Colfax Avenue. Survey respondents here noted the amount of traffic and that they felt that there was so much traffic it was uncomfortable to cross, particularly at this intersection, and that there would be interest in an intersection improvement. So designs to help make that crossing more comfortable for everyone, whether you're walking, biking, or driving. We also heard from folks that it's often difficult to see or be seen when crossing at Crimeria Colfax, regardless of how you're choosing to get around. And it feels a bit unsafe. So again, that's something that we have an eye towards as we develop our concept design. We also heard about potential speeding problems and concerns and a desire to see slower traffic. So I do want to note that we are still evaluating East Colfax and Crimeria, understanding exactly what options will look like here. So while we don't have a particular concept to show at this intersection today, did want to note that in our concept surveys, the second round of them, we are looking to gather more feedback to help us as we do further analysis and really guide what the solution looks like here. And so with that, I am now going to talk about our concept designs and how we can continue to provide feedback as a community on those designs. So see the website here, that's bit.ly/Kearney Survey 2, where we have additional surveys open that are a little more detailed than the first survey we had open earlier in the spring. You will see some examples of the concept design as we have it developed so far, and have an opportunity to give us additional feedback and answer some questions to help us ensure that we're hitting the mark and really hearing what the particular problems and concerns are across the corridor so that we can align our designs to match and meet those based on what we're hearing from the community. And on the next slide, just want to highlight in the survey from earlier this spring, we did hear loud and clear that there are some priority locations, particularly at intersections and crossings, that the community would really like to see improved as part of this project. So these are listed here. That's at Colfax Avenue, East 6th Avenue, 23rd and Crestmore Park, Alameda Avenue, as well as 13th and 14th Avenues. These were all locations that have popped in our initial survey, and you'll see that reflected in the surveys that we are launching tonight with some of our initial ideas of how to address that, as well as designs throughout the corridor. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Taylor to speak in more detail about what some of our initial concept designs are looking like, given the feedback we heard earlier this spring. Taylor?
Well, thanks, Ellen. Cool. So I'm going to walk us through kind of what we heard from our previous survey, as well as some of the types of improvements that you might see in our initial design for Kearney and Krameria. So one of the most common concerns that we heard is that many of the intersections along the corridor need intersection crossing improvements. So these types of improvements can come in all shapes and sizes, depending on the street in question. For intersections of two local streets with lower vehicle speeds and volumes, something like a curb extension can help people walking, biking, and driving to see one another and shorten the crossing distance for people walking. At more major intersections, things like pedestrian signals and short bike lanes and waiting spaces for bicyclists at the intersection, like those in the photos, might be needed. You'll see all three types of treatments along the corridor. So we also heard that there are locations where it's difficult to see or be seen along the corridor. Treatments like curb extensions and marked crosswalks can help motorists be more aware that people may be crossing the street. They also help all roadway users to see each other, increasing visibility and yielding rates. Next slide, please. Many people would also like to see slower motor vehicle traffic on the corridor. Traffic circles are one such improvement that are placed in the middle of intersections to help slow vehicle speeds and increase driver awareness. Some of the treatments that we talked about before, including curb extensions, can also have a similar effect. Next slide, please. And finally, we heard that there's too much car traffic on the Kearney-Krameria corridor. While we aren't currently recommending any hard diversion that would disallow cars from driving on the street, all the treatments we discussed earlier will work in harmony to create an environment where people walking and biking are clearly prioritized. This is referred to as soft diversion, and vehicle traffic can often be found to decrease when we make it more difficult for drivers to speed or cut through a neighborhood quickly. So with that, I'd like to open it up for, I guess we have another discussion question time.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a lot of questions and we're going to try and get to every single one. If we can't, we will make sure that we have a document, a frequently asked questions document that you can refer to online, and we'll get that uploaded as soon as we possibly can. We're going to start with a question from Amy, who states that she understands that this project will not affect parking, but she does have a specific question about parking on Kearney between 22nd and 23rd in front of, there's a business block on the corridor at that point.
Riley, do you want me to take that one?
Sure.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Nora. This is a good question. So as Riley indicated earlier, the selection of a neighborhood bikeway is intended not to affect parking on the corridor and change the parking supply on the corridor. The block between 22nd Avenue and 23rd Avenue in the business district there is a unique block on the corridor for sure. Currently, that block has angled parking on both sides, and specifically it has front-end angled parking on both sides. The work thus far does not recommend changing the supply there, so the number of parking spaces would not be changed on Kearney. We do as a team want to have a discussion with the businesses and property owners and residents on that block to know whether they would be supportive of changing that from front-end angled parking to back-end angled parking. The reason for that is that there's safety benefits for all users of back-end angled parking on that block. But as we've thought through that block as a team, we've felt that that's a conversation we need to have with the property and business owners specific and residents specifically on that block. So short answer is no changes to the overall number of parking spaces. How that parking is configured, that might be something that is in flux as a part of this.
Thanks, Charlie. Moving a little further down the corridor, going from north to south, we have a question about Crimeria between Colfax and 13th. Motorists frequently use the bike lane to pass left turning vehicles without looking for people on bikes. This individual has had numerous close calls at this location and would like to see a protected bike lane at the very least in this location.
Yeah, Riley, I can take that one as well. Yeah, this is definitely, I mean, in terms of unique segments of the corridor, this is another one sort of between 16th Avenue and 13th Avenue. And obviously those blocks are a little bit different from one another. But suffice to say, the team is aware that the I'd say intensity of traffic in this segment is different than other portions of the corridor. And we're looking from feedback from from participants tonight, as well as in the mechanisms that Riley and the team are going to discuss later to inform what that looks like. For the segment from Colfax to 13th Avenue, the city's bikeway selection guidelines currently suggest that the volume and speed would warrant a buffered bike lane just for the segment from 13th to Colfax. That's something that we've thus far shown in the conceptual designs, but very open to input on that from the community.
And one thing I do want to add is in that small section of the street, there already is a bike lane. So between Colfax, it's between 13th and Colfax, or 12th and Colfax, where there is an existing bike lane. So that part of it is separate from the neighborhood bikeway for the rest of the corridor because of that issue, because of that.
Thanks, Riley and Charlie. Again, traveling all the way down to the southern end of the corridor, we do have a question about a traffic circle. Will a traffic circle be added at Kearney and Southmore Drive? This particular individual, again, has noted that this is a particularly dangerous intersection.
Yeah, I think I can take that. So our concept design right now at that intersection includes curb extensions. We can certainly look into the idea of a traffic circle at that intersection. However, I'm going to anticipate that large vehicle turning movements will be an issue because of the three-way intersection nature of that particular intersection. We need to be able to get like things like fire trucks around the traffic circles and things like that. So, but we can definitely take a look and see if that would be something that's worth putting in.
And I'll just add to that, currently we're looking at curb extensions, which again are those paint and post extensions of the curb to really improve visibility. And those also do help in terms of slowing turning movements. So as Taylor mentioned, with this being a T intersection, and particularly one at the park where there are a lot of people walking and crossing, that's part of why we have proposed that in the initial concept design. But again, to Taylor and Riley's points, we're very open to feedback and hearing if there are additional considerations that we could take into account with those designs. But that is part of the background there of thinking about how we can increase visibility, slow turning movements, and really meet the need of who is there today.
Thank you. Staying on the subject of traffic circles and moving a little further down the park to the southern end of the park, have you taken into account the heavy traffic and parked cars when considering the traffic circle at First and Kearney?
Yeah, I can take that. So we actually would not be removing any parking, I don't believe, at that intersection. And it actually is one of the lowest vehicle volume segments of the intersection or of the corridor per some vehicle counts that we did in December. So it probably shouldn't affect traffic too much at that location.
And I'll just add really quickly, just as a baseline for our concept development for all projects for bikeways, we do data analysis to Taylor's point. We do collect traffic information and turning movement counts so that we can understand exactly what's happening During COVID, we've actually added, a process so that we're ensuring that we're aligning with the normal time values and not just the differences that we've seen due to COVID. So we do have a process for that and have accounted for that in our analysis. And we really look at what designs make sense throughout for the people using it, again, to slow speeds and prioritize local traffic, but still provide access.
We do have actually a late breaking question related to that intersection with a concern about getting in and out of a driveway at that intersection. And if you could speak to how a traffic circle might or may not impede in and out from a driveway.
So I can.
And I'm just, this is at Third or First? Can you clarify, please?
First and Kearney.
Oh, I'm sorry. So First and Kearney, we actually don't have a traffic circle. We have curb extensions shown, which should not impede the driveway in any way.
Thanks for clarifying, Taylor.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Pulling out a little bit in terms of our broader thinking, were there alternative routes considered for this corridor, particularly through the Crestmore neighborhood?
So I can start with that question, Nora, and then maybe Ellen can feel free to tack on. We did look at a number of different routes, and one of the things I actually want to back up and start with the fact that that section of Kearney Street is signed as a bike route today. So you'll notice that there are signs throughout it that say bike route on them. And a neighborhood bikeway is kind of similar to a bike route in that it's, like we mentioned, it's not necessarily a painted bike lane or anything, but just improvements that make it continue to be safe. And so the purpose of the neighborhood bikeway and improving the street is to really improve it and benefit the people that are already using it today and continue to improve safety. With that said, though, we did look at some additional routes. We looked at Ivy and Jersey and a number of different streets that were to the side. And each one of them kind of presents a different challenge when we looked at it. Looked at the feasibility of different routes. Some of those being Alameda, because it has a median, we'd have to, on certain streets, would have to either reconstruct the median or reconfigure it. On some locations, it just wasn't feasible because the street doesn't really provide a connection into anything. So those were some of the factors that we looked into when we were selecting the routes, but we did do an analysis of that and also looked into what streets had signals, where can we get people across, that kind of thing. And that kind of is what led us to this particular route. With that said, I do want to emphasize that Dottie does try to be flexible. So we are still open to hearing feedback, especially if there's particular concerns as we continue to work with the Crestmore Park neighborhood with concerns related to the park and the interaction between bikes and vehicles that's largely happening today and how we can improve that.
Thanks, Riley. I'll just add to that a little bit as well. Just zooming out from a citywide bike network process, I've seen some questions in the chat just about how was this corridor chosen versus, the several hundred north-south corridors that we have in Denver. And I do want to highlight that desire lines are an important process of network planning. So to Riley's point, understanding where people are going today and where there are destinations within neighborhoods and communities in Denver that we can, further improve corridors for everyone trying to reach them. One of those destinations being Crestmore Park. And so that did play into the alternatives analysis. But as Riley mentioned, we did consider several different routing opportunities in this section of the corridor. Based on our analysis and community feedback, we have developed an initial concept routing it near Crestmore Park. Obviously, are still open to feedback on what that looks like. But our goal, again, is to really serve the people that are already there and recognize the opportunity that these improvements help everyone using the road and help increase visibility and safety for everyone. And often in placing those near the destinations where people are already going, there's a strong kind of like bang for your buck factor. So all of those have played into this analysis, but again, just want to highlight based on what we have conducted so far in terms of our data analysis, community feedback, moving forward with this initial concept, but again, open to feedback. And that's why it's so important that we hear from you in the surveys that we're launching today.
Wonderful, thank you. The next two questions are actually very practical questions related to particular treatments. Why not do 3- and 4-way stops instead of a traffic circle?
So Taylor or Charlie may give you that question.
That's a good question. So traffic stop signs are pretty meticulously planned throughout a neighborhood to prioritize different streets and different movements. And we like to try to minimize messing with that. In addition, we're trying to prioritize bicycle through movement here. And if we have stop signs at every intersection, it's going to be a lot harder for folks riding bikes to stop at every intersection. And that doesn't encourage people riding bikes to use the corridor. So we try to minimize the stopping and starting for people riding bikes while also slowing motor vehicle traffic. And that's kind of where the traffic circle really comes in handy.
Yeah, there's also some pretty well documented research on all-way stops and the effect of what happens between stop signs when you add a lot of stop signs in neighborhoods. And generally the effect is that the more stop signs there are, particularly when people don't feel like they're maybe justified if you're arriving at a lot of stop signs and not seeing other traffic, and yet you always have to stop. People tend to compensate for that by speeding up between the stop signs mid-block, right? Which is an undesirable effect for everyone. So yeah, back to Taylor's point, we deliberately focus on traffic circles for that reason, to provide a more predictable style of travel, as well as to mitigate potential for increased speeds between the stop signs or between the intersections at that point.
One other thing that I want to add is just with the consideration of traffic circles, we are in the concept design survey that we shared with you earlier, and we'll share with you again. There is a way to provide feedback on that. So if there is a location that we've identified or proposed a traffic circle, and you have feedback about that, there is a way on that survey to provide feedback about the traffic circle, especially if you have concerns or just kind of general input, or you feel like there is something else that would be better done to improve that intersection. You're certainly welcome to that and open to that feedback. I do also want to highlight that so far, there's only about 2, or I think 3 or 4 locations along the entire corridor where we're looking at a traffic circle. So certainly not at every street or every block or anything like that. I just wanted to highlight that part too.
Riley, there's actually a follow-up question. When you say you're only looking at a few traffic circles along the corridor, there is a participant who wants to know if all the traffic corridors are on the southern end of the corridor in Crestmore, or if they're being used throughout.
So these are being used throughout, and Taylor, I might point to you for the exact locations. I know that's kind of, we've discussed spacing them out across the corridor, so they're certainly not concentrated in one area.
Yeah, on the southern half of the corridor, they're only at Severn and at 3rd. And then I think Charlie might be able to answer the northern half of the corridor. Do not have that pulled up.
Yeah, I'm pulling that up now. I'm trying to remember if we have any on the northern part of the corridor, which is to say north of Colfax. I think the answer to that is no. I think we looked at a couple in the northern part of the corridor, but let's see, I call it the valley gutter. The gutters that go through the intersections are present at multiple locations in the northern part of the corridor. that make traffic circles difficult from a feasibility perspective at those locations.
Yeah, so I just took a look and it is certainly, yeah, just Severn and 3rd. There aren't any in the northern half, Charlie.
Thanks, Taylor and Charlie. This next question is probably for you as well. How can you put in curb extensions at Southmore and Kearney in particular, as this neighborhood, Crestmore, doesn't have curbs or sidewalks? How do you account for a lack of curb when putting in a curb extension?
I can speak a bit to that, and then others, please feel free to join in. So maybe it's a bit of a misnomer in locations like around Crestmore Park where there isn't a sidewalk, but the curb extensions are paint and post extensions. And really what they're aimed to do is to increase visibility, improve those sight triangles for people interacting at the intersection. And that benefit is realized whether or not there is a curb and sidewalk. And so by putting these in throughout the corridor, and particularly in the Crestmore area, there are still benefits to be realized for people using this corridor, whether they're walking, biking, or driving.
Thank you, Ellen. We have, this next question pertains to the southern end of the corridor, and in particular, a synagogue on Kearney. Where 250 people come for services on the weekend. There's also a preschool and programming throughout the week. And while parking won't be affected, the question is, will there be extra traffic coming down the street, and how might that impact that particular location?
So I can start with a broad answer, and then, Riley, Taylor, please feel free to jump in. But again, the goal of a neighborhood bikeway is to allow for local traffic and allow for access, but ensure that the trips that remain on that corridor, particularly the vehicle trips, are moving slower. And if there are other ways for people to access what they need to, maybe prioritizing those routes, because this space is clearly prioritized for people walking and biking, while still allowing access for everyone to use the road. So we don't anticipate or calculate like additional traffic being added to the space, but again, rather using these designs as an opportunity to help better demarcate and formalize the sharing that already occurs by people using this corridor in different modes. So whether they're walking, rolling, biking, or driving.
Yeah, and just to add on to that these kinds of treatments are not intended to increase any vehicular traffic, but rather to discourage that, especially as Denver continues to grow and as streets become busier, to keep this as a low volume local street as it exists today.
Thanks, Ellen and Riley. We do have a question related to the study behind the selection of this corridor, and in particular traffic counts. Now that the stay-at-home orders are being lifted, and we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with the pandemic, are there any plans to do some additional counting and studying of use of the park on Sundays and Saturdays during soccer season and during the summer months when the park is heavily used?
So I can start with the first part of that question, and then also answer the second, and then Ellen or Charlie, feel free to elaborate here. So when we did our analysis to understand speeds and the traffic volumes that are on the street during the pandemic, we have factored into our study and accounted for the decrease that was associated with the pandemic. So our traffic counts are essentially trying to factor in for what they would be if there wasn't the pandemic and if we were seeing normal traffic volumes. And we have, one of the things that we've also looked at is worked with our parks department to pull all of the permits to give us a general idea of the car traffic that's generated from all of the events that take place at the park, particularly during the weekend, so that we have a more accurate picture of what that looks like during non-COVID times.
Thanks, Riley. Bouncing back up to the northern end of the corridor, there is a question about attempting to slow traffic and vehicle speeds, not between 13th and Colfax, but slightly further north between Colfax and 16th Avenue, where the corridor becomes less of a commercial corridor and more of a residential one.
I can take that one, Nora. Yeah, hearing this question, this comment makes sense. It's sort of, I guess, predictable when you've got a street that connects to Colfax like that with a signal. When I was talking about consideration of sort of a higher power treatment from 13th Avenue to Colfax, we're definitely attuned to needing to look at what happens on that block between Colfax and 16th Avenue. That doesn't mean it needs to be a bike lane or that it will be a bike lane. I think there's different options there, but suffice to say, the team is really looking at that whole segment from 13th Avenue to 16th Avenue to figure out exactly what the design is going to look like in those blocks to make it workable and improve safety for everyone using the street. Driving, walking, biking.
Thanks, Charlie. We do have another very practical question about intersections and whether the heavily foliaged trees that block intersection sightlines, if keeping those intersections clear from that foliage, if that will be enforced as an intersection daylighting option.
So I can speak a bit to this, and then I don't know, Dana, if you wanted to add in. This is something that we look at as we get further in the design process. If you remember the slide I spoke to earlier of the general process, we're in the very early stages right now developing options and concepts, but as we get more towards that finalized design state, we do field reviews and field visits where we can identify things like tree branches and foliage that we'll need to coordinate with our internal ops teams to help trim that back. There's also opportunities, I believe it's through 311, and Dana, maybe this is where you can help me, where you can report that, and in some cases, then we can ask that homeowners, if it's on their property, can trim foliage as well to help with those safety goals. So a couple options there.
And Ellen, unfortunately, I think Dana actually had to join another public meeting, and
I'm sorry. Well, then I'm 90% sure that is correct, but if it's not, we can update in FAQ.
Ellen, I'm just checking on 311, and weeds and vegetation is a category that you can submit on 311. So I think you're correct.
Good deal. Call it 100% correct then. Thank you, Charlie.
We do have a question from a participant who was on our previous meeting as well, asking about a statement made prior that there are studies that show that increases in traffic actually lower the number of accidents, and he wanted to follow up on that to understand that statement and what the backing to and references were for that statement.
So I can start with that question. I think that meant more just in cities around the country in general, not necessarily on a street in particular, but just in general. When you see increased traffic where speeds are going slower, it will sometimes slow down vehicles simply just because they're going slower. I would say that that's kind of not necessarily something that applies to this corridor because it's a low volume, low street, and the idea of it is to not encourage there to be a lot of traffic on it. so that it is friendly for the people that are currently living on the corridor, as well as for pedestrians and bicycles. So I think that might have just been more of a general statement.
Thanks, Riley. We do have one last question for the evening before I turn it back to Riley to wrap us up. This is slightly off the corridor, but will there be pedestrian crossing improvements across Monaco? In particular, the current walk buttons are offset from the curb, which means that one has to roll into high-speed traffic to press the button. Anyway, I don't know if we start with Riley on that one.
That's a great question. And that's one that I would normally hand over to Dana as she's our kind of expert on everything that's going on in this part of the city. But that's something that feedback that we can document and that we can look at while it might not be directly addressed by this particular project is something that we can take a look into.
And I'll just note, I'm aware of one potential opportunity. I'm leading public involvement for a neighborhood bikeway on 12th Avenue, and that does cross Monaco Parkway. So that is within the scope of that project. And we'll have a meeting later this month on the 25th to discuss our initial concepts for that corridor as well. But there are improvements, at least at 12th and Monaco, based on that project I'm aware of. But again, just to underscore Riley's previous answer, unfortunately, Dana would be our subject matter expert on things out of project scope in the neighborhood.
Thanks, Riley and Ellen. I'm going to turn it over to Riley to wrap it up and tell you how you can continue to be engaged with this project going forward.
Great, thanks so much, Nora.
And Riley, I just want to mention that your video is off. We might want to see your handsome thing.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize it was off. So thanks so much, Nora. Just as a reminder, we are looking for feedback on the design concepts. We know that we didn't show you every particular intersection tonight just because it is such a long corridor. However, if you go to the bit.ly website, so it's bit.ly/Kearney Survey 2, that is how you'll be able to provide us feedback on the projects, and not only will you be able to see what is being recommended intersection by intersection and what's being proposed, but then there is a way to take a survey and provide your feedback on those recommendations or on those improvements. On that same page, there's also a place to give us some general feedback. And again, there you can also find more information about the project on the project website, which is at the bit.ly/Denver Moves Backbones. There is a way that you can sign up to talk to the project team in more detail, as well as just get general project updates and sign up to be on our contact list so that you stay updated. And then do want to emphasize also that you can reach us at bikes@denvergov.org in case there are specific questions that we did not get to. We will try to provide a Q&A sheet that we will put on our website, so that way, if there are questions that didn't get answered tonight, or if there's general questions, we can continue to summarize those at that website. Again, do you want to encourage everyone to share this with your neighbors as well as your friends to check out the bit.ly/Kearney Survey 2 page, where you will be able to view the proposed recommendations as well as provide feedback on those recommendations. As Ellen said before, we really do value the feedback that you give us, and we do take that feedback and try to incorporate it into our project, and oftentimes are flexible and make tweaks to our designs based on what we hear from you. So we really do appreciate the feedback that you are able to provide us. So with that, I want to let everyone be able to get back to their meeting since it is 6:30. So I do appreciate everyone taking the time out of their schedule to join us, and please stay well, and thank you again for joining us.